The rain had been falling since dawn, washing the sleepy streets of Portland in a dull silver haze. Inside a small, neatly kept house at the edge of town, Margaret Ellis sat by the window with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. She was 68, slender, with soft gray hair always pinned into a bun, and eyes the color of worn jade, gentle but alert. Her living room smelled faintly of lavender and old books, a space that mirrored her calm, disciplined nature. For 35 years she had taught English literature at Lincoln High School before retiring, and though she now lived alone after her husband's passing, her days followed a quiet rhythm. Morning tea, reading, tending to her garden, and calling her son. Ethan had always been her pride, her only child. As a boy, he'd been bright and affectionate, with unruly brown hair and a smile that could melt away any of her worries. But the man who now walked into her house that afternoon was not that boy. Ethan Ellis, 35, carried the easy charm of a salesman and the restless eyes of someone who always wanted more. His dark hair was styled too perfectly, his jawline sharp but unshaven in a way meant to look casual. He wore an expensive watch that caught the light whenever he moved his hands, and behind every smile lurked calculation. Beside him was Chloe, his wife of 3 years, tall, blonde, impeccably dressed, the type of woman who seemed to belong to glossy magazine pages. She had an air of cool politeness, always smiling, but her eyes rarely softened. "Mom," Ethan began, dropping his car keys onto the table. "Chloe and I were talking. That house of yours, it's too big for you. Don't you think it's time to sell?" Margaret looked up from her tea, her fingers tightening around the cup. "Sell? This house was your father's dream, Ethan." Her husband, David Ellis, had built it with his own hands after years working as an architect. He had been quiet, kind, and deeply practical, the opposite of their son. He'd passed away 10 years ago from heart failure, leaving Margaret a widow and the house full of memories. "Exactly," Ethan said smoothly, sitting across from her. "Dad would want you to be comfortable. You're alone here, Mom. If you sell this place, you could move closer to us. We could help you with everything." Chloe leaned forward, resting a manicured hand on Margaret's arm. "It's just that we worry about you," she said softly. "Big house, empty rooms. It must get lonely." Her tone was sweet, but her smile was tight, rehearsed. Margaret's heart tugged at the suggestion of closeness. She had always imagined growing old surrounded by family. Maybe it was time to be nearer to Ethan. Maybe this was love in its practical form. Within 2 months, Margaret had sold her house for a modest but decent price and bought a small cottage near Ethan's home in Lake Oswego. Ethan had offered to handle the finances, insisting it would be easier for him to manage her savings and expenses. Margaret hesitated, but his tone was so confident, so full of that old boyish warmth, that she handed over the bank details. For a while, everything seemed fine. Ethan visited every week, usually asking if she needed groceries or help with bills. Chloe dropped by with store-bought muffins, always bringing her little white Pomeranian named Coco, a prissy creature with pink bows in its fur who barked at everything that moved. Margaret didn't particularly like the dog, but she smiled anyway. Still, something inside her began to change. The warmth of their visits was brief, conditional. Ethan often checked his phone during dinner, and Chloe's compliments always came with hidden judgment. "You really should modernize this place, Margaret," she said once, looking around at the floral wallpaper. "It's so vintage." One rainy evening, while balancing her checkbook, Margaret noticed a withdrawal she didn't remember making. $3,000 transferred to Ethan's account. When she asked him about it the next day, he laughed. "Oh, that? I paid for the contractor fixing your roof, remember?" But she did remember. She had paid cash. Something cold stirred in her stomach. Weeks passed, and more small amounts vanished. Each time, Ethan had an explanation ready. Insurance, utilities, minor emergencies. Margaret told herself she was imagining things. She didn't want to believe her son could lie. Then one Saturday morning, while looking for old family photos, she discovered a stack of bank statements hidden behind her bookshelf, recent printouts she had never requested. Each showed transfers, thousands of dollars, all to Ethan's name. Her hands trembled as she held the papers. That evening, when Ethan and Chloe came for dinner, she couldn't bring herself to eat. The stew on the table went cold while she watched them laugh together. "Ethan," she said finally, her voice shaking, "why are there transfers from my account to yours?" His laughter froze. Chloe looked up sharply. "Mom, don't start this again," Ethan said, sighing as if she were an unreasonable child. "I've been managing your bills, remember? Managing doesn't mean taking. You're getting forgetful, that's all." Chloe cut in smoothly, her tone almost soothing. "We've noticed it lately. Maybe you've been under stress." Margaret felt her chest tighten. "I am not forgetful," she whispered. Ethan's smile turned thin, almost pitying. "We'll talk later," he said, standing. "You should rest." When they left, the silence in the house pressed down on her. She walked to the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, and for the first time in her life, she felt small inside her own home. Later that night, she called Nancy, her oldest friend from her teaching days. Nancy Cooper was 70, short and lively, with silver curls and a booming laugh that could fill any room. A retired pediatrician, she had the sharp, no-nonsense tone of someone who had spent decades telling people uncomfortable truths. "Maggie," she said after hearing everything, "this isn't forgetfulness. It's theft." Margaret's throat tightened. "He's my son." "That's exactly why it's dangerous. You need to protect yourself." "From Ethan? From anyone who sees your kindness as weakness?" Nancy's words echoed long after they hung up. Margaret sat in her armchair, the clock ticking softly behind her, and realized something she had never dared admit before. She didn't really know who her son had become. Outside, the rain stopped, leaving behind a quiet that felt too heavy, too knowing, as if the world itself had paused to watch what she would do next. The morning fog rolled through Lake Oswego like a pale veil, softening the sharp outlines of the houses and trees. Margaret Ellis sat at her small kitchen table, the ticking of the wall clock echoing too loudly in the silence. Her hands trembled as she unfolded her bank statement. Line after line, she saw purchases she didn't recognize. An expensive handbag store, a spa, a restaurant she had never visited. She stared at the numbers, confusion giving way to a cold wave of dread. Her breath quickened. Ethan must have made a mistake, she told herself. Maybe he'd used the wrong card. Maybe Chloe. She stopped mid-thought. Her son wouldn't do this without asking, would he? Margaret took another sip of coffee, bitter and cold now, trying to calm the shaking in her chest. When Ethan arrived that afternoon, the sound of his car pulling into the driveway usually brought comfort, but this time, it filled her with unease. He came in wearing his usual navy jacket, phone in hand, his confident stride making the small living room seem even smaller. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his eyes sharp but unreadable. "Mom, what's wrong?" he asked, noticing the papers spread across the table. Margaret's voice was soft but steady. "Ethan, I found these charges on my credit card. Did you or Chloe use it for something?" For a moment, he froze. It was just a flicker, but Margaret saw it, the split-second panic behind his calm expression. Then he smiled. "Mom, You probably just forgot. You've been a bit stressed lately. His tone was gentle, practiced, the same tone he used when convincing clients to sign contracts. No, Ethan, she replied quietly. I don't forget things like this. His jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Chloe entered. She looked flawless, dressed in a cream blouse and high-waisted jeans, her hair in perfect waves. Margaret, she said sweetly. Ethan told me you were worried. You really shouldn't get yourself upset over small things. Small things? Margaret repeated. You used my card without permission. Chloe sighed, her voice dipping into that careful tone of pity that always made Margaret feel small. You must have given it to us, honey. You probably just don't remember. We've been helping with your bills for months. Margaret felt her stomach twist. The way Chloe said honey, as if speaking to a confused child, was unbearable. I never gave you permission, she said. Ethan frowned. Mom, you're tired. Maybe it's time we talk about getting some help. Someone to check in on you. You've been forgetting things. The room seemed to close in around her. Forgetting things? She repeated, her voice trembling. I'm not losing my mind, Ethan. Don't talk to me like that. Ethan's smile was gone now, replaced by an expression of irritation he didn't bother to hide. We're just trying to help, he said flatly. You're making it difficult. When they left, Margaret stood in the doorway, watching their car pull away. The sound of the engine faded, but her heart still pounded. For the first time, she saw them clearly, not as the children she had loved and trusted, but as strangers wearing her sons' and daughter-in-law's faces. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat in the living room with only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft drip of rain on the roof. The word, forgetting, echoed in her head. They were planting seeds, tiny, poisonous ones, to make her doubt herself. She picked up her notebook and wrote the date in neat cursive. October 3rd, they used my card. They lied about it. Said I'm forgetting. The act of writing steadied her trembling hands. She would keep records. She would not be erased. The next day, she met Nancy Howard for lunch at a small cafe downtown. Nancy, a retired doctor and her closest friend, was a tall woman in her 70s with short silver hair and sharp gray eyes that missed nothing. Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone used to being listened to. You look pale, Margaret, Nancy said, stirring her tea. Is something wrong? Margaret hesitated, then told her everything. The charges, the confrontation, the accusations about her memory. Nancy listened without interrupting, her brows furrowing deeper with each word. That's not forgetfulness, Nancy said finally. That's manipulation. They're gaslighting you, Maggie. The word hit hard. Gaslighting, Margaret repeated softly, as if testing it. You need to protect yourself, Nancy continued. If money or documents go missing, you'll have proof. Get a small security camera. Something hidden. A camera? Margaret's voice was uncertain. It feels untrusting. It's not about trust, Nancy said gently. It's about safety. That night, Margaret sat at her desk, thinking. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the moonlight poured through the curtains, silver and cold. She ordered a small camera online, a simple one that could record in silence. 2 days later, she installed it in the living room, pointing subtly toward the hallway and the entrance to the backyard, where the storage shed stood. She hated doing it. It felt wrong to spy on her own child, but the fear in her chest was stronger than the guilt. Days passed uneventfully. Ethan didn't visit. Chloe sent short texts, polite but distant. Margaret began to hope she had been overreacting. Maybe things would go back to normal. Until Friday night. She had gone to bed early, exhausted from a day of restless thoughts. But something, a soft noise outside, pulled her from sleep. She checked the clock. 2:47 a.m. The sound came again, a faint click, like a door latch. Margaret rose quietly, her heart thudding, and glanced out the window. Through the mist, she saw a figure moving toward the shed. She froze. The man was tall, shoulders broad, moving with careful familiarity. The porch light caught his face for a moment. Ethan. He was holding a flashlight, his jaw set, his movements deliberate. Margaret watched him unlock the shed, step inside, and emerge a minute later carrying a small folder and the spare keys to her safe. Keys she had hidden months ago. Her breath caught in her throat. Why? What could he possibly need? She wanted to shout, to run outside, but fear held her still. She waited until he disappeared down the path, then sat on her bed, trembling violently. Tears rolled down her face. Her own son, her perfect boy, had broken into her shed in the middle of the night. By morning, she felt hollow. She downloaded the footage, her hands unsteady. The camera had caught everything. When she played it back, she saw Ethan's face illuminated by the flashlight beam, calm and focused. There was no hesitation, no guilt, just purpose. Margaret stared at the screen until her eyes blurred. Somewhere deep inside, something broke. The realization settled like a stone in her chest. She was not safe anymore, not even from him. The wind howled through the pines outside Margaret's house, carrying with it the metallic scent of an approaching storm. The afternoon light was pale and cold, filtering weakly through the lace curtains as Margaret stood by the window, holding the folder she had retrieved from the shed. Inside were her financial documents, bank statements, insurance policies, and the spare keys Ethan had stolen. Her hands trembled slightly, but not from age, from fury, from betrayal. When Ethan arrived that evening, she was ready. She heard the crunch of tires on gravel, the heavy slam of a car door, then his familiar voice calling, "Mom?" He stepped inside without knocking, as if it were still his home. He wore his usual gray wool coat, the collar turned up against the cold. His hair was damp from the rain, and his jaw was tight. Chloe followed close behind, her designer boots spotless, her perfume, something floral and expensive, filling the air. "We need to talk," Margaret said before they could speak. Her voice was low, steady. Ethan frowned. "About what?" "You broke into my shed." Ethan blinked, feigning confusion. "What are you talking about?" "Don't lie to me, Ethan. I saw you." She held up her phone, showing the paused video from the security camera. His face, illuminated by the flashlight beam, stared back at him. For a second, all color drained from his cheeks. Then he scoffed. "You really are paranoid, aren't you? Watching your own son on hidden cameras?" "You forced me to!" she shouted, the restraint cracking in her voice. "You stole from me! You lied to me! What kind of son does that?" Chloe stepped forward, her tone calm and venomous. "Margaret, lower your voice. You're overreacting again. We came here to help you, not to fight." "Help me?" Margaret snapped. "By stealing my money? By sneaking into my house in the middle of the night?" Her heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. Ethan's eyes darkened. "You're losing it, Mom. You're not thinking straight. Maybe Nancy's putting ideas in your head." "Don't you dare talk about Nancy," Margaret said, her voice trembling with fury. "She's the only person who actually cares about me." Chloe sighed dramatically and pulled out her phone. "See, Ethan? This is what I meant." She started recording discreetly, keeping her face composed. Your mother's having another outburst. Margaret didn't notice at first. She was too angry, too hurt. Years of being manipulated, guilt-tripped, used. It all poured out at once. You're monsters, she said. You both are. You took everything your father and I built, and now you want what's left of me. Ethan's lips curled into something between pity and disgust. You need help, Mom. You're sick. The word sick cut through her like glass. Get out, she said quietly. Get out of my house. Ethan hesitated, then shrugged. Fine, but don't call us when something happens to you. He turned and walked out, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled in its frame. Chloe followed, but not before giving Margaret a long, assessing look, a predator's gaze disguised behind painted lashes. For a moment, Margaret thought she saw satisfaction flicker across her daughter-in-law's perfect smile. When the house finally went silent again, she sank onto the couch. Her chest ached as if something inside had cracked open. She had loved Ethan more than anyone in the world. Now, all that remained was disbelief, and the faint terror that maybe, somehow, he was right. Was she really losing her mind? She went to bed late that night, her thoughts heavy and sharp. The storm broke around midnight. Rain hammered against the windows, lightning split the sky, and thunder rolled through the hills like an omen. Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling, remembering every word Ethan had said. You're paranoid. You're sick. She whispered into the darkness. I'm not crazy. 2 weeks passed with no word from them. Margaret spent her days tending her garden, trying to restore order to her small world. Nancy checked in often, bringing groceries and light conversation that steadied her nerves. But a strange unease still hung in the air. The neighbors, people who had always waved before, now looked at her differently. Some avoided eye contact altogether. One morning, while walking to her mailbox, Margaret noticed Mrs. Campbell, the elderly woman next door, whispering to her husband as they both stared at her. When she met their eyes, they quickly turned away. Inside the mailbox lay a thick white envelope. Her name was written in bold, formal print, Margaret Ellis. The return address was from the county courthouse. She opened it slowly, her fingers trembling, scanning the words. Petition for guardianship. Her knees almost gave out. Ethan and Chloe were listed as the petitioners. They claimed she was mentally incompetent and unable to manage her financial and personal affairs. Her stomach dropped as she read further. Attached were statements from witnesses describing erratic behavior, paranoia, confusion, emotional outbursts. She felt sick. There was even a mention of video evidence showing her in a state of emotional distress. Her blood ran cold. The recording, the one Chloe had made. Margaret clutched the papers, her breath shallow. This was no misunderstanding. It was a trap, carefully built, perfectly timed. Every insult, every accusation, every manipulation had been leading to this. The phone rang, startling her. She answered with a shaking hand. Margaret? It was Nancy. Her calm, steady voice was a lifeline. You sound awful. What's happened? Margaret told her everything. The lawsuit, the lies, the recording. She could barely finish before tears choked her. Nancy was silent for a moment. Then she said firmly, They're trying to take control of your estate. You need a lawyer. Right now. But I don't have anyone. I know someone, Nancy interrupted. His name is Thomas Weber. He helped one of my patients years ago in a similar case. He's fair, and he won't be intimidated. Margaret wiped her eyes. Do you really think I can fight this? You can, Nancy said. And you will. You have truth on your side. but we have to move fast." That night, Margaret sat at her desk, rereading the court documents. The words blurred and shifted, heavy as stones. Fear crept into her chest, but beneath it, something else began to burn. Anger. They thought she would crumble, that she would retreat into confusion. But they had underestimated her. She had survived her husband's death, years of loneliness, and decades of sacrifice. She would survive this too. As lightning flashed through the window, Margaret whispered to herself, "You started this, Ethan, but I'm the one who'll finish it." The morning air in Portland hung heavy with drizzle, a thin mist curling around the maple trees that lined Mapleview Lane. Margaret Ellis stood at her kitchen window, watching the gray light seep through the fog. The quiet that used to soothe her now felt suffocating. Every glance out the window reminded her that the world outside was no longer hers. The whispers had begun 2 days ago. She heard them first from Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman across the street who used to bring her freshly baked cookies. "People are saying you've been forgetting things," she had murmured awkwardly, eyes darting away. Margaret had smiled politely, pretending it didn't hurt, pretending she didn't notice how the neighborhood had begun to look at her differently. In truth, she was breaking. Ethan and Chloe had gone too far this time. When she received the legal notice demanding that she relinquish financial control under a guardianship petition, she had felt the floor vanish beneath her. Now, even her neighbors were part of their story. The story that painted her as a fragile, confused old woman. That afternoon, the sound of rain tapping against her porch blended with distant laughter. She peered through the curtains and saw Chloe standing outside with Sarah Jenkins, the young mother who lived next door. Chloe's tall, slim figure was wrapped in a beige trench coat, her honey blonde hair tucked neatly behind her ears, makeup flawless even in the drizzle. Sarah was nodding, concern written across her youthful face. Margaret knew that expression well, pity disguised as compassion. Her stomach twisted. She wanted to scream at them, to tell Sarah that Chloe was lying, manipulating everyone like a puppeteer. But instead, she turned away and sank into her worn-out armchair, gripping the armrest as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored. Her thoughts spiraled. When had Ethan, her sweet boy with the soft brown curls and shy smile, turned into this stranger? She remembered the years after her husband Thomas passed away. Ethan had stepped in like a hero, helping her manage the bills, fixing the leaky roof, calling every day. He had seemed so devoted until Chloe came along. Chloe with her ambition, her sharp green eyes that always looked like they were calculating. Margaret had tried to welcome her, had tried to be the mother-in-law who didn't interfere. But Chloe had a way of making her feel small, of turning every word into a criticism. Now, it was clear. Chloe wasn't satisfied until she had taken everything. The doorbell broke her thoughts. When she opened the door, Nancy was there, holding a large umbrella and wearing her usual sensible gray raincoat. Nancy was a retired doctor in her early 70s, with cropped silver hair and a warm but no-nonsense demeanor. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, missed nothing. "You look terrible, Maggie," Nancy said softly. "You haven't been sleeping, have you?" Margaret forced a weak smile. "How could I? They're trying to take everything, Nancy. Even my mind." Nancy stepped inside, shaking off her umbrella. "You're not crazy, and you're not alone. I told you I'd help." She handed Margaret a folder. "I've spoken to someone, Daniel Brooks. He's a lawyer who specializes in elder abuse cases. He's tough, smart, and most importantly, he hates bullies." Daniel Brooks arrived the next morning. He was in his early 40s, tall, with a broad-shouldered build and a neatly trimmed beard. His gray suit fit him perfectly, and his deep-set hazel eyes had a mixture of warmth and sharpness. The look of a man who had seen too much injustice to tolerate any more. When he spoke, his voice carried calm authority. "Mrs. Ellis," he said, offering a firm handshake. "I've reviewed what Nancy sent me. You're in a difficult position, but it's not hopeless." Margaret studied him carefully. There was something about his tone, steady but empathetic, that made her trust him almost immediately. "They've made everyone think I'm losing my mind," she said, her voice trembling. "They even have videos, edited ones." Daniel nodded slowly. "Classic coercive control. It happens more than you think. But we'll need evidence to counter it. The original footage from your security cameras, financial statements, anything that proves you're competent and that they've been exploiting you." Margaret hesitated. I think I have something. The night Ethan took the keys and papers, the camera caught him. I didn't delete it." Daniel leaned forward, eyes glinting. "That's a good start. We'll build from there." For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt a flicker of hope. Still, the weight of isolation clung to her. Every time she stepped outside, she felt the stares. At the grocery store, the cashier's polite smile faltered when she saw her name on the card. At church, people whispered behind hymn books. Ethan and Chloe had poisoned her reputation perfectly. That evening, the book club met at Nancy's house. There were 5 of them, women Margaret had known for years. Helen, a widowed librarian with a passion for mystery novels. Ruth, a cheerful redhead who ran the local bakery. And Laura, a quiet former nurse with kind eyes. They all welcomed her with tea and scones, pretending it was just another meeting, but the air was thick with unspoken concern. "We're with you, Maggie," Ruth said finally. "We know you're not crazy. Chloe's been talking too much around town, and it doesn't sit right with any of us." Margaret's throat tightened. For the first time in weeks, she felt tears, not of despair, but of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Nancy smiled. "Let's focus on getting you through this legally. Daniel's good. He's helped women who've been taken advantage of by their own families before. And he's cute," Ruth added with a wink, making everyone laugh. The laughter felt like a balm, a reminder that she wasn't completely invisible. But later that night, when Margaret returned home, the shadows in her hallway seemed deeper. The silence pressed in. She checked the locks twice before sitting on her bed. Her hands trembled as she looked at a framed photo of Ethan as a child, grinning, holding a fishing rod next to his father. "Why, Ethan?" she whispered. "Why would you do this to me?" Somewhere in the darkness of her house, a floorboard creaked. Margaret froze. For a moment, she thought she saw movement outside her window, a silhouette near the shed. Her pulse quickened. She reached for the flashlight on her nightstand and crept toward the back door, every step echoing in her chest. When she opened it, the yard was empty. Only the rain fell softly on the grass. But she could have sworn she saw the shed door moving slightly, as if someone had been there just seconds ago. She stood in the cold air for a long time, listening, until her nerves gave way and she locked everything again. Maybe she was imagining it, or maybe Ethan had come back for more. In bed, she stared at the ceiling, realizing that her life, once peaceful, predictable, had turned into a nightmare orchestrated by the 2 people she had loved most. But now, she wasn't entirely powerless. She had Nancy, she had Daniel, and most importantly, she had truth. Buried, perhaps, but still hers to uncover. The rain had finally stopped, leaving Portland wrapped in a cool hush. The air smelled of wet earth and cedar, and pale sunlight shimmered across the slick pavement outside Margaret Ellis's house. She stood by the window, fingers tracing the rim of her teacup, her reflection faint against the glass. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel entirely powerless. Daniel Brooks had given her a plan, and that plan began today. "A psychological evaluation will clear your name," he'd said 2 days ago. "If we can prove you're mentally sound, their entire guardianship case collapses." Still, a knot of anxiety twisted inside her. Ethan was her son. She had loved him beyond reason. The thought of legally defending herself against him felt like tearing open an old wound. That morning, she arrived at the office of Dr. Laura Chen. The building was modern but calm, with soft lighting and faint music that smelled faintly of lavender. Dr. Chen, a petite woman in her mid-50s with straight black hair streaked with silver, greeted her warmly. Her almond-shaped eyes held both intelligence and patience, the kind that comes from years of listening to broken people. "Mrs. Ellis," she said, shaking her hand firmly. "Please, come in. We'll take our time today." Margaret studied her, calm voice, measured movements, no judgment in her gaze. "I suppose Ethan and Chloe think I'm crazy," she said, her voice bitter. "They've convinced everyone else." Dr. Chen smiled gently. "Let's find out what's true, shall we?" The session lasted 2 hours. Dr. Chen asked about her memory, her finances, her emotions, her sleep. At first, Margaret answered stiffly, feeling defensive, but gradually her guard dropped. She talked about Thomas, her late husband, the man who had once made her laugh until she cried. She talked about Ethan as a boy, how he'd been quiet and sensitive, how she'd once found him crying when his pet hamster died. And then she talked about the shift. How, after Thomas's death, Ethan's warmth had been replaced by calculation. "Sometimes," Margaret confessed softly, "I wonder if I made him this way. Maybe I spoiled him. Maybe I loved him too much." Dr. Chen listened without interrupting, then closed her notebook. "Mrs. Ellis," she said firmly, "you are entirely lucid. You are grieving, hurt, and understandably mistrustful. But you are not delusional. In fact, your insight is unusually sharp for someone in your situation. I will document that clearly." When Margaret left, a weight seemed to lift from her shoulders. She felt almost dizzy with relief. Daniel called later that day. "Laura Chen's report is solid," he said. "It'll make it hard for Ethan's lawyers to argue incompetence. Now, we focus on evidence." He arrived the next morning, his usual crisp suit replaced with jeans and a dark jacket. Without the formal armor, Daniel looked more human, a man with faint lines around his eyes and a quiet gravity that hinted at his own losses. Margaret noticed he wore no wedding ring. Over coffee, he explained the next steps. "We need to collect proof. The unedited footage, any fraudulent transactions, witness testimony. It's time to hit back." Nancy joined them, setting a folder on the table. "I've already pulled some of Margaret's bank records," she said. "There are multiple transactions to an unknown account labeled under Chloe's maiden name, Chloe Whitaker." Daniel's eyes gleamed. "Perfect. That's what we need. Fraud and misrepresentation. If we connect this to coercion, we can file a countersuit." Over the next few days, their little team, Margaret, Nancy, and Daniel, worked like detectives. Margaret stayed up late combing through old receipts and bank statements, sometimes feeling tears blur her vision. Each charge she found felt like a betrayal carved deeper into her chest. There was even a $3,000 furniture purchase she'd never made, the same couch sitting in Ethan's living room. The worst part was the video. Chloe had sent copies to the lawyer and even the neighborhood association. The edited version showed Margaret shouting incoherently, waving her arms, her voice breaking. but Daniel retrieved the original file from the cloud storage linked to her security system. The truth was painfully different. It showed Ethan yelling first, slamming his fist on the counter, calling her senile when she demanded her money back. Margaret's supposed outburst was really a mother breaking down in fear. "We'll use this," Daniel said, his jaw tight. "They wanted to bury you with lies. Now they'll face their own." Yet the victory felt fragile. Margaret couldn't shake the unease that Ethan would retaliate. Her fear proved right that Thursday evening. It was nearly dark when headlights swept across her driveway. She was in the living room, sorting papers, when the doorbell rang, loud and insistent. Her heart skipped. Through the peephole, she saw Ethan. He looked disheveled, eyes bloodshot, jaw tight with anger. Gone was the polished, confident son she once knew. He looked dangerous. "Mom," he barked as soon as she opened the door. "We need to talk." "You shouldn't be here, Ethan," she said, gripping the doorknob. "Daniel told me." "Daniel!" he snapped. "That lawyer's filling your head with garbage. You're sick, Mom. Chloe and I were trying to help you." "Help me?" she echoed, voice trembling. "By stealing my savings? By turning my neighbors against me?" His nostrils flared. "You don't know what you're talking about." He took a step forward, and instinctively she stepped back. "Ethan, stop." For a moment, his face softened. The boy she once knew flickered there. But then it hardened again. "You're ruining everything," he said through clenched teeth. "You're going to regret this." Margaret's pulse pounded. "Get out," she whispered. When he didn't move, she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. Ethan froze, eyes narrowing. "You'd call the cops on your own son?" "If I have to," she said, her voice shaking. "Yes." The silence between them stretched until distant sirens began to wail. Then, with a cold smirk, he turned and walked away. The flashing lights arrived moments later. 2 officers, one older with graying hair and kind eyes, the other young and alert. The elder officer, Sergeant Miller, took her statement gently. "You did the right thing, ma'am," he said. "We'll file this as a harassment and intimidation report." Margaret nodded, barely able to stand. After they left, Daniel arrived, concern etched across his face. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded faintly. "He looked like someone I didn't recognize," she whispered. Daniel sighed. "This will actually help us. The police report strengthens your case. It shows his aggression. Sometimes the best evidence is the truth they hand you themselves." Margaret looked at him, eyes glistening. "Do you really think I can win this?" He smiled faintly. "I don't take cases I don't believe in." That night, she sat at her kitchen table long after midnight. The house was silent except for the ticking of the old wall clock, the same one Thomas had fixed years ago. She thought about how Ethan had once loved that sound, how he'd sit in his father's lap, listening to the pendulum swing. Now, the sound felt like a countdown, not to her ruin, but to her reckoning. She no longer felt like a helpless old woman. The fear was still there, yes, but beneath it burned something stronger. Resolve. Ethan had taken everything from her, her peace, her reputation, her trust. But he hadn't taken her will to fight. Not yet. The courthouse loomed under a gray sky, its stone facade streaked with rain that had just begun to fall like a whisper over the town. Margaret stood at the entrance, clutching her umbrella, her fingers trembling slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of the moment. She was dressed in a navy blue suit that had once belonged to her husband, adjusted by her tailor to fit her small frame. Her silver hair, tied neatly in a low bun, framed a face that carried both sorrow and resilience. At 70, Margaret looked fragile, but her eyes, sharp and blue like winter ice, betrayed an inner strength few had seen before. Daniel Brooks, her attorney, walked beside her. A man in his mid-40s, Daniel was tall, with broad shoulders, and a square jaw softened only by the kindness in his brown eyes. His dark hair was sprinkled with gray at the temples, and he carried an air of calm authority. He had once worked in corporate law, but turned to defending the elderly after his own grandmother was defrauded by a caregiver. A story that left deep scars and ignited his sense of justice. "You're ready, Mrs. Whitaker?" he asked softly. Margaret nodded. "I've been ready since the day they called me insane." Inside, the courtroom was filled with tension. Ethan and Chloe sat at their table, both impeccably dressed as if appearance alone could win them sympathy. Ethan, her only son, had grown into a man who resembled his late father physically. Tall, handsome, dark-haired, but lacked his warmth. His sharp jawline and deep-set eyes gave him an air of confidence, but to Margaret, it was just arrogance disguised as charm. Chloe, in contrast, wore a beige blazer and pearl earrings, her blonde hair curled into soft waves that framed a smile too perfect, too rehearsed. She looked like a magazine cover of virtue, but Margaret knew the venom beneath that gloss. Judge Helen Patterson entered the room, her presence immediately commanding silence. In her late 50s, with iron-gray hair cut short and sharp eyes behind rimless glasses, she had a reputation for fairness and intolerance toward deceit. The trial began with Ethan's attorney, a slick man named Gregory Hill, presenting their case. "Your Honor," he began, pacing smoothly, "my clients only sought to protect their mother. Mrs. Whitaker has displayed alarming forgetfulness, erratic behavior, and has been targeted by individuals who prey on the elderly. They acted out of love and concern." Chloe dabbed at her eyes with a tissue at the perfect moment, earning sympathetic looks from a few in the audience. Ethan, too, sighed deeply, glancing at his mother as though heartbroken. Margaret clenched her jaw. Their performance was flawless, and for a moment she feared it might work. Then it was Daniel's turn. "Your Honor," he said, rising with quiet authority. "Concern is one thing. Manipulation and fraud are another." He turned to the screen as the first piece of evidence appeared. A video. Clip. The same video Chloe had edited where Margaret had appeared to be yelling incoherently. But Daniel played the uncut version. The courtroom watched as the full truth unfolded. Ethan shouting first, calling his mother paranoid, while Chloe secretly recorded her anguish. Gasps rippled through the room. Margaret lowered her eyes, ashamed but relieved that the truth was finally visible. "We also have financial records," Daniel continued, handing a file to the judge. "These documents show unauthorized withdrawals from Mrs. Whitaker's account, all signed by Mr. Whitaker, her son." He paused, letting the evidence sink in. "And here, testimony from Dr. Laura Chen, a licensed psychiatrist." Dr. Chen, an elegant woman of East Asian descent in her early 50s, stood from the audience. She had a calm, analytical air, with sleek black hair and intelligent eyes. "After multiple sessions with Mrs. Whitaker," she testified, "I found no signs of dementia, delusion, or any cognitive impairment. She is completely capable of managing her affairs." Her tone was firm, leaving no room for doubt. Ethan's mask cracked slightly. He shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. Chloe reached for his hand, but he pulled away. Daniel's final piece of evidence came from Officer Ramirez, a local police officer who had responded when Ethan stormed into Margaret's house weeks earlier. "I arrived on scene to find Mr. Whitaker yelling and threatening his mother," Ramirez said. "She was visibly frightened. We have the audio from my body camera if needed." Ethan's attorney tried to object, but Judge Patterson overruled him. The courtroom fell silent again as Margaret took the stand. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate, her eyes steady. "Mrs. Whitaker," Daniel said gently, "can you tell the court what this past year has been like for you?" She inhaled deeply, her voice trembling only at first. "It's been lonely," she began. "After my husband died, I trusted my son to help me. I thought he wanted to protect me. Instead, he took my money, my peace, and nearly my dignity. They made me doubt my own mind. But I am not crazy. I am old, yes, but not broken." She turned toward Ethan. "I raised you to be kind. I don't know when greed became your god." Ethan's eyes hardened, but he said nothing. Chloe stared at the table, her facade beginning to crumble. When Margaret stepped down, the courtroom was quiet enough to hear the rain tapping against the windows. After a pause, Judge Patterson spoke. "This court has seen many forms of betrayal," she began, "but few as cold as the betrayal of a parent by her child." She glanced at Ethan and Chloe. "The evidence is clear. The defendants are guilty of fraud and defamation. The petition for guardianship is denied. Furthermore, they are ordered to repay Mrs. Whitaker's legal fees and restore the misappropriated funds." The gavel struck. The sound echoed like thunder. Ethan's shoulders slumped. Chloe covered her face and began to sob. Not from remorse, Margaret suspected, but from humiliation. Daniel turned to his client, smiling softly. "You did it, Margaret," he said, but she shook her head. "No, Daniel, the truth did." Outside, as the rain eased into a gentle drizzle, Margaret stood on the courthouse steps and felt the air fill her lungs. Cool, cleansing, alive. She wasn't just free from their lies. She was finally free from fear itself. She looked up at the gray sky and whispered to herself, "Harold, I hope you're proud." Then, for the first time in a long while, the morning sun in Santa Fe rose over the desert horizon like liquid gold, spilling warmth across the adobe houses and cacti gardens. A soft breeze carried the scent of sage and sand, brushing against the open window of Margaret Ellis's new home. She stood before a blank canvas, brush in hand, her gray hair gathered into a neat bun. The light caught the fine lines on her face, not as marks of age, but of endurance. A year had passed since the trial. The court's verdict had not only cleared her name, but restored something even more valuable, her sense of self. Margaret had sold her old Portland house soon after, and donated part of her savings to a foundation for elderly abuse victims. "No one should fight alone," she'd told Daniel when signing the papers. Now, she lived in a quiet casita just outside Santa Fe, surrounded by red rock and endless sky. It was small but perfect, one bedroom, a studio filled with light, and a garden where lavender grew wild. Her days followed a gentle rhythm. Morning walks through the dusty trail behind her home, painting until the sun reached its peak. Lunch at the corner cafe owned by Rosa Alvarez, a cheerful widow in her 60s who made the best tortilla soup in town. Rosa was short and plump, with silver curls and warm brown eyes that always seemed to smile. "You paint with your heart, señora," Rosa often said, watching Margaret sketch. "That's why people feel something when they look." Margaret would only smile softly in reply. The exhibition, her first, was scheduled for that weekend. She had titled it "The Price of Love." Every painting told a part of her story. A cracked teacup symbolizing betrayal, an empty chair in a storm, a tree regrowing after lightning. Her favorite piece was a portrait of a woman standing alone on a bridge at dawn, neither broken nor triumphant, but free. Sometimes she still woke in the night to echoes of her old fears, the shouting, the accusations, Ethan's eyes blazing with anger. But now, when those memories came, She didn't push them away. She painted them. Each brushstroke was a way to reclaim power from pain. On Thursday, as she arranged the final pieces at the small gallery downtown, Daniel Brooks walked in. He looked different, more relaxed than the last time she'd seen him. His dark hair had grown slightly longer, his suit replaced by a casual blue shirt and jeans. Yet his calm, steady presence remained the same. "So this is what victory looks like," he said, smiling as he studied the paintings. "You've turned your story into art." "It's not about revenge anymore," she said softly. "It's about closure." Daniel nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I've been working on similar cases since yours," he admitted. "But yours reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place." Margaret smiled faintly. "To fight for the truth? To remind people they're not alone." For a moment, they stood in silence, surrounded by the quiet hum of the gallery lights. There was something unspoken between them. Not romance, but respect, forged through shared battles. When he left, he promised to return for the opening night. That evening, Margaret sat on her porch with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the sky shift from orange to deep violet. A stray cat, a lean gray tabby with a torn ear and cautious green eyes, appeared near the steps. She'd seen him around before, always keeping his distance. "You again," she murmured, setting down a saucer of milk. "You can stay if you want. I don't bite." After a moment of hesitation, the cat approached and began to drink. Margaret smiled. "We're both strays now, huh?" The night before the exhibition, she found an envelope in her mailbox. No return address, just her name written in Ethan's familiar handwriting. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a letter, short, written in uneven strokes. "Mom, I don't expect forgiveness. Chloe and I divorced. She said I ruined everything, and maybe she's right. I've been going to therapy. They say guilt can be a kind of punishment, but it doesn't feel like enough. I'm sorry for what I did, for letting greed turn me into someone you'd fear. I hope you're happy now. You deserve that. Ethan." She stared at the page for a long time. Once, she would have wept, her heart torn between anger and longing. But now, she simply folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside her bed. The next morning, she wrote in her journal, the same leather one Daniel had gifted her after the trial. "I have lost a son, but found myself, and that is the most precious gift life could offer." The gallery buzzed that evening. Local artists, retirees, and travelers wandered through, stopping to study her paintings. Rosa arrived with a bouquet of sunflowers. Daniel brought a bottle of champagne. Even Dr. Laura Chen sent a note from Portland, congratulating her on her rebirth. When the crowd quieted, the gallery owner, a tall, elegant man named Victor Reyes, known for his passion for emerging artists, asked her to speak. Victor was in his early 40s, lean with dark olive skin, neatly trimmed beard, and the serene confidence of someone who had rebuilt his life more than once. "Would you like to say a few words, Mrs. Ellis?" he asked. Margaret stepped forward, her palms slightly damp. Public speaking had never been her strength, but tonight felt different. "These paintings," she began, "come from a place I once feared. Pain has a way of convincing us we're powerless. But when we face it, when we tell our stories, it loses control over us. I painted because I needed to remember who I was before fear, before shame, before betrayal. I hope these colors remind you that even after everything, there's still beauty in survival." The room fell silent for a moment before a wave of applause filled the space. Daniel caught her eye and gave a small nod, one of quiet pride. Later that night, After everyone left, she stood alone in front of her favorite painting, The Woman on the Bridge. The moonlight filtered through the gallery windows, illuminating the brushstrokes like veins.